On January 12, 2007, the body of a woman was discovered in the Rambouillet forest, located west of Paris. It was headless, with arms gnawed off by wild boars, and a gaping wound in the chest suggesting the heart was missing. The body was in a state of decomposition. The woman was lying on her back along a fallen tree trunk, as if someone had left her there hoping that wild animals would reach her before the police. However, she was found by a passerby shortly before noon. He ventured a bit deeper into the forest and, about 15–20 meters from the roadside, made this gruesome discovery, which he quickly reported to the police. The main question was whether the woman had suffered an accident and then been scavenged by wild boars, or if she had been murdered. The forensic expert who arrived at the scene made a preliminary conclusion that it could not have been an accident, and the woman had likely fallen victim to a homicide. Most probably, she had died 6 weeks earlier. Although this was only a preliminary assessment, the difficulty of working in a forest or open-air setting lies in the exposure of the body to rain, snow, wind, and attacks by animals and insects. The only reliable way to establish a more accurate time of death was through entomology, specifically the study of larvae and insects on the victim's body. Consequently, the forensic expert transported the body to the forensic medicine department, while the gendarmes began investigating the crime scene in a spiral pattern, starting from the location where the body was found and moving outwards. During the investigation, the gendarmes found a bra, a wig, a black evening dress, and a robe. Cadaver dogs specially trained to search for human remains were also brought in, but they were unable to locate the victim's head. The forensic expert conducted the autopsy on January 15, 2007. The deceased was identified as a woman around 60 years old, of average build. A large wound on her chest indicated that some organs were missing. Indeed, the heart was not in place. The pathologist was unable to formally determine the cause of death. The woman could have died either as a result of decapitation or from the chest wound. The killer had severed her head with a sharp instrument while the heart was still beating or immediately after her death. The first thought that comes to mind is that the perpetrator removed the head and hands to make it impossible to identify the victim. A DNA sample was taken from the woman and sent to the National Genetic Fingerprint Registry, which contains all DNA samples on record. The identification of the victim happened remarkably quickly, despite what might have been expected. After all, the deceased had neither a head nor hands, which meant that there was no way to take fingerprints, identify her through dental records, or make a facial reconstruction. Nevertheless, within just 5 days, her name was established. The gendarmes considered individuals who had gone missing several months earlier. Distinctive features such as an average build, a recent scar near the gallbladder, and the approximate height and weight of the woman, accounting for the missing organs, suggested that she might be a woman who had disappeared in the fall of the previous year. A DNA comparison confirmed this assumption. The decapitated body belonged to Nicole Sutter. On November 10, 2006, it was a holiday, and someone decided to celebrate it at a dance evening. The event was supposed to take place at Nicole Sutter's Argentine Tango School. However, for some reason, the host of the evening was not there to greet the guests. People gradually gathered and began to wonder, where is Nicole? The woman had not informed anyone that she would be late, which was completely unlike her. Friends and students called her mobile and home numbers several times, but without success. Nicole's daughter tried to reach her over the next few days, but the more time passed, the clearer it became that something had happened. She then reported her mother's disappearance to the police. The detectives began their investigation into the disappearance by studying the victim's background. Nicole worked as an accountant, but after retiring, she decided to turn her passion for dancing into a profession. She resumed dance lessons, earned a diploma, and in 1996 opened a school where she taught tango. The school was successful and Nicole was considered an excellent instructor. Her friends also loved and valued her. A friend recalls that she was an extraordinary woman who gave all her friendship unreservedly, asking for nothing in return. It was enough to ask for something, and she was always happy to help. Nicole was an expressive woman with a contagious laugh, passionate about her role as a mother and grandmother. It was clear that she enjoyed life and did not suffer from depression. She was certainly not the kind of person who would simply run away at the age of 62. The police's theory that Nicole did not run away on her own was confirmed fairly quickly. Forensic experts discovered stains on the white-tiled floor of her garage, which she had converted into a dance studio. These were drops of blood, Nicole's blood. However, at this stage of the investigation, the detectives still believed that Nicole might be alive and possibly kidnapped. A search was conducted in her home and on the surrounding property. Since she lived on the edge of the Montmorency forest, the gendarmes explored the nearby ponds and forest areas adjacent to her house, hoping to find any clues. But all efforts proved futile. The only lead was a romantic relationship with a man that had ended 3 months earlier, so investigators wanted to learn more about these connections. The man's name was Christian Jimenez, a 72-year-old divorcee who had entered Nicole's life with a bang in 2004. Since his arrival, much had changed. They met in Paris at a dance event workshop. Christian was a fairly good dancer, and that brought them closer. Nicole spoke about him enthusiastically to friends, claiming she had found her true love. They started dating, and soon Christian Jimenez was present at all family gatherings with Nicole. He became the president of her dance school and even started teaching there. Nicole began spending more and more time with him, drifting away from her family and friends. But suddenly, their love story came to an abrupt end. In August 2006, Nicole broke up with Christian. However, this was far from the end, because Christian Jimenez was not the kind of man to simply allow a woman to end things with him so easily. He took the breakup very badly and looked for every opportunity to see Nicole. His pursuit of his former lover seemed suspicious to the gendarmes, and 8 days after the woman's disappearance, on November 18th, they decided to speak with him. Christian Jimenez arrived at the police station carrying a bag. Although he and Nicole had broken up, he still had keys to her house, mailbox, and garage, where bloodstains belonging to the victim had been found. It seemed like his way of signaling to the police that he had nothing to hide. In addition, a knife was found in his bag, which the police confiscated. Interestingly, on the same day, November 18th, shortly before noon, investigators learned that the victim's car had been found burned in a town where Christian Jimenez also lived. They informed Christian that his former lover's vehicle had been discovered approximately 800 meters from his house. In response, the man suddenly jumped up and exclaimed that they burned the car near his house. However, the investigator hadn't mentioned the condition in which the vehicle was found. Christian revealed his own guilt, as only the police and the arsonist knew that Nicole's car had been set on fire. The car was located on the banks of the Seine River in the commune of Artissement, prompting divers to search the river for any evidence that might help locate Nicole. At the same time, detectives found that on the day of Nicole's disappearance, Christian had been in the municipality of Daumont, where Nicole lived. This was confirmed through the pinging of his phone. His route on the day of the woman's disappearance looked extremely suspicious. He traveled from the municipality of Daumont, where Nicole resided, to Artissement, back to his own home, and then to the Rambouillet forest, where the body was found. Thus, investigators had evidence contradicting Christian Jimenez's statements. The man was arrested, and while he had been willing to cooperate with detectives before, he now became withdrawn and silent. When the gendarmes arrived at his home with a search warrant, they were struck by how bright, cozy, and warm Nicole's house was, in contrast to Christian's. His home was physically uncomfortable to be in. It wasn't dirty, but the windows were painted over, casting a shadowy gloom inside, as if the man sought complete isolation. In addition to that, he had a collection of animal paws preserved in formaldehyde, a liquid used for taxidermy. It was a peculiar collection. It's unlikely there is another collector in the world with something similar. Christian later explained that he started gathering this collection for an exhibition, but it was still a very strange choice. All of this added new details to an already grim portrait, something detectives would later confirm by speaking with his children and ex-wife. During the search, the officers discovered a receipt for 98-octane fuel. This was curious because the man's car runs on diesel fuel, while Nicole's car uses gasoline. The investigators contacted the gas station and obtained footage from surveillance cameras on the evening of Nicole's disappearance. The video clearly showed Christian appearing at 11:30 p.m., driving the victim's car. He pulled up to the pump, filled the tank with fuel, and also filled a canister, totaling 15 liters. He then drove off, paying with his own bank card. This evidence allowed the detectives to establish a clear link between him and the disappearance of his former lover. In addition to this, a drop of blood belonging to Nicole was found on his jeans, which became the final piece of evidence that allowed them to charge him with the kidnapping of Nicole. At that point, investigators still did not know where the woman was or whether she was alive. However, they were confident that Christian had knowledge of this. Christian held the key to this mystery. In light of the new evidence, they were eager to hear the man's explanations, especially since he had previously insisted that he knew nothing about the case. So Christian has to explain the evidence collected by the police while managing to get away unscathed. He told a completely incredible story. According to him, unknown individuals in black clothing, hoods, and masks are responsible for Nicole's disappearance. Detectives had repeatedly heard stories about mysterious strangers in black from suspects who, trying to get out of trouble at all costs, denied the obvious. Christian claimed that Nicole's disappearance was beneficial to third parties. It was a fantastic statement, but the investigators decided to listen to how the man would present the story. Christian began by saying that on the afternoon of November 10, 2006, he arrived at the shopping center that Nicole always visited, hoping to see her. However, he dozed off while sitting in his car. He woke up in the evening, still in the same parking lot. He did not see Nicole, but an unknown person approached him. An unknown person in black clothing and a hood frightened Christian and got into his car. He ordered him to drive to Nicole's house, and Christian complied. In the rearview mirror, he noticed that 2 other people were following them in another car. Thus began a long journey lasting more than 3 hours from Nicole's house to Christian's home. Along the way, the kidnapper ordered Christian to refuel and fill a canister with gasoline. At this point, the unknown man got out of the car just before entering the gas station. As investigators later established, no witnesses saw people in black clothing and hoods. Christian was the only one captured by the surveillance camera. Nonetheless, Christian continued his story, claiming that he saw 2 kidnappers carrying something long wrapped in a blanket and concluded that it could have been Nicole's body. When both cars arrived at his house, the kidnappers handed him a bundle of Nicole's keys and told him to go home and keep quiet. That's why he didn't tell the police anything from the very beginning. When the officers asked Christian who he thought these people were, he replied that they were probably the Argentine Tango Mafia, or possibly Jehovah's Witnesses. He was convinced that such a mafia existed because Nicole had a friend, a tango teacher, who had also been attacked. However, despite claiming to be frightened, this did not prevent him from rushing to his hairdresser immediately after the kidnapping. When investigators asked him about this, he responded that this visit had been planned. Indeed, how could he not go? The detectives laughed at the scenario presented by the suspect. They decided that he must have seen this in some movie, but his story did not match the collected evidence. There was neither a beginning nor any proof in this version, and he couldn't provide a description of the kidnappers. At the same time, the investigators had a mass of evidence. The victim's car that he drove, blood on his jeans, a knife seized from him, which had the victim's DNA on the blade, and keys to Nicole's house found in his bag. There was sufficient evidence, yet Christian still insisted on his innocence. A psychiatrist who examined the man stated that he suffered from paranoia. Therefore, he might truly believe that what happened to him was real. To learn more, the investigators closely examined Christian's life, and they found many surprises. Allegedly a retired engineer and a veteran of military operations with many high-ranking friends. He was actually a lonely old man with a dark past. If you met him on the street, you would smile at him warmly because he looked like an ordinary retiree. Well-groomed, with neat mustaches and a classic shirt, he liked to present himself well and appeared to be in excellent physical shape. However, to present himself in a certain light, Christian Jimenez did not shy away from lying. Unfortunately, Nicole believed him. She was charmed by a man who was always around and who had an answer to all her questions. Gradually, he gained access to all her accounts and took control of her school. Christian assured Nicole that he knew better how to run the school, and students who came to learn from her began to leave, realizing that she could no longer do anything on her own, that she had lost her voice. Christian stifled her with his demands. Moreover, he isolated her from everyone, family, friends, students, so that she belonged only to him, completely controlling her life. But unexpectedly, something made her wake up and break off with Christian. For someone like Christian, suffering from paranoia, this was unbearable. He began to stalk Nicole everywhere, and then he killed her. When Nicole's body was discovered in January 2007, Christian had already been under arrest for nearly 2 months, accused of her kidnapping. But this did not affect his version of events one bit. The trial of Christian began on June 16, 2008. The victim's family hoped to learn the whole truth about how Nicole died, but Christian said nothing. He continued to insist on his version that he was also a victim of kidnappers, the Argentine Tango Mafia, who had dealt with Nicole and burned her car 800 meters from his house to frame him. However, several witnesses took the stand, and their testimonies made a monumental impact. First of all, Christian's own daughter testified about how terribly he treated his daughters and their mother. When she was 7 years old, she was subjected to harassment by her own father. He did the same with her sister, his second daughter, when she was 10 years old. But that wasn't all. Nicole's daughter testified that her 4-year-old daughter, Nicole's granddaughter, had been subjected to even worse harassment by the man. On the very day of Nicole's disappearance, She was supposed to testify to the police regarding her little granddaughter. She had received a summons in the mail, and Christian, who had the key to Nicole's mailbox, probably learned about it. Later, the investigator informed Nicole that she did not need to come on the 10th, but not knowing this, Christian might have decided to go through with his plans. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 20 years. But he did not stop there and filed an appeal. On June 29, 2009, the appeals process began in Versailles. By this time, the defendant had studied his case from A to Z and practically defended himself. The family addressed Christian directly, which is usually not done in court. The atmosphere was very heavy. The family could no longer bear it. The uncertainty had lasted too long. But once again, they heard nothing from him. The court did not need much time to reach its verdict. At the end of the appeals process, Christian was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 22 years. A year later, he was sentenced to an additional 4 years for what he had done to his daughter when she was little. Many mysteries still remain regarding the tragic end of Nicole. Where was she killed? Why were a wig and clothing found near the body? Where did Christian hide the head of his victim? Investigators and psychologists believe that he took the head with him as a fetish, wanting to keep a part of her, as if saying, "Now you will always belong to me." Acknowledging the obvious facts would inevitably require him to reveal where the head is located. Christian tried to control every woman in his life. After his divorce from his wife and before meeting Nicole, he dated another woman who was very ill. Christian did not allow her to listen to her doctor's advice and forced her to undergo treatment according to his directives. Perhaps the roots of his behavior go back to his childhood when he lived with an authoritarian mother, and adult responsibilities were placed on him at a young age. However, a difficult childhood in no way justifies the man's behavior. The fact that he ruined the lives of at least 3 underage girls and took the life of a woman who simply wanted to give him a happy life in a family hearth cannot be excused. May 18, 2006. The owner of a recreational boat was heading towards Santa Catalina Island, a rocky island in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California. As he traveled, the man noticed seagulls circling over something in the water. There were many birds, screeching in a frenzy. Suddenly, he realized there was a body floating in the water. That was what had attracted the persistent birds. The boat owner immediately contacted the Coast Guard, who in turn called the sheriff's office. A heavily decomposed body was pulled from the water. It was in terrible condition. The only certainty was that it belonged to a human. The person was fully clothed and, based on the attire, appeared to be a man. However, his face was disfigured after prolonged exposure to the water. The body was found in an area frequented by international shipping lanes. These lanes are used by vessels delivering goods and passengers to the port of Los Angeles from all over the world. This led to the plausible assumption that the man had been aboard one of the cruise ships or cargo vessels. It seemed likely the poor soul had fallen overboard and drowned. The body was taken to the coroner's office, initially classified as a drowning victim. However, during the autopsy, the medical examiner discovered a bullet lodged in the deceased's head. The angle of entry made it clear that the victim was unlikely to have shot himself. The police launched a homicide investigation, with the first priority being to identify the John Doe. The deceased was fully dressed, even wearing gloves. When the medical examiner removed them, he found that the man was missing 3 fingers on his left hand. The fingers had not been eaten away by marine life. They had clearly been surgically amputated many years earlier. But no missing person reports in Los Angeles County, nor on the peaceful Santa Catalina Island, mentioned an individual with amputated fingers. The victim had been wearing fairly expensive shoes, indicating that he was unlikely to have been a crew member on a ship. More likely, he was vacationing or owned his own boat. Attached to the shoes were barnacles, calcium-based shells belonging to small marine crustaceans. A specialist identified them as gooseneck barnacles, a species found only in specific areas, including the backside of Catalina Island. This evidence suggested that after the man was killed, his body had entered the water near the backside of Catalina Island. By analyzing the varying sizes of the gooseneck barnacles, the specialist also estimated that the body had been in the water for approximately 15 days. However, it was unusual for a body to remain in the same area of the ocean for so long unless weighted down. Why hadn't it drifted further out to sea? This anomaly was explained by a weather phenomenon unique to the Southern California Bight: circular water currents. These currents trap objects, spinning them around the island. Thus, instead of being carried away into the open ocean, where the body might never have been found, it was caught in one of these currents. This whirlpool effect eventually brought the body to the front side of Catalina Island, where it was discovered. For a week, the police struggled to identify the victim. Then a man reached out to the detectives, worried about his missing friend. Having heard news reports about the discovery of a body, he feared it could be him. When the detective asked for distinguishing features, the man immediately mentioned that his friend had lost 3 fingers on one hand in a woodworking accident during school. This couldn't have been a coincidence. The body was identified by family members as 59-year-old Stephen Bailey Williams, a former radio DJ who had lived in San Pedro. The police began interviewing Stephen's friends and relatives to understand how he ended up near Santa Catalina Island. Stephen Bailey Williams, also known to fans as Stephen B., possessed extraordinary charisma and a magnetic voice, deep, resonant, and captivating. These qualities earned him a job on the radio, where he co-hosted a popular morning show in Denver. For many years, the show enjoyed tremendous success. Eventually, the station decided to move in a new direction, and there was no room for Stephen. As someone deeply passionate about his work, he struggled to accept being let go. Still, he didn't give up. He enrolled in culinary school and began crafting meals perfectly paired with specific wines, excelling in this new pursuit. Around 2001, Stephen's father's health deteriorated, and he moved in to care for him. For 2 years, Stephen devoted himself to his father's well-being. When his father passed away, he left Stephen a substantial inheritance, nearly $2 million. This windfall came just 3 years before Stephen's body was found. A new millionaire should have been enjoying life, but instead, Stephen lay lifeless on the coroner's table. Stephen found it challenging to manage the sudden wealth and the myriad bills that came with it. His friends described him as a creative and immensely talented individual, but one who was far from savvy with finances. Stephen could even forget, entirely in earnest, to pay his taxes. In September 2003, a close friend visited Stephen's home, bringing along an acquaintance named Harvey Morrow. Harvey was a former Wall Street financial advisor. His keen eye quickly noticed the unopened mail and the pile of bills on Stephen's table. During their conversation, Harvey realized that Stephen was overwhelmed and struggling to manage his affairs. Harvey offered to help untangle the mess. To Stephen, it seemed like Harvey was heaven sent, a guardian angel stepping in to save him. Grateful, Stephen entrusted Harvey with the management of his accounts and financial documents. Stephen's friends were happy for him until they realized that things were not as perfect as they seemed. Stephen regularly dined with his friend Sylvia Nolan. In 2005, they met once again in a restaurant, but Stephen didn't have the money to pay for his meal. He was very embarrassed. Sylvia paid the bill and wanted to lend him some money, but he refused. Sylvia, as a close friend, asked Stephen directly, "How can you have no money? You inherited $2 million and you can't afford to pay for your food?" Stephen replied that Harvey had put his money into an offshore account. It would remain there until he and Harvey withdrew it together. Sylvia remembered that someone had recently broken into Stephen's car and stolen various documents from the trunk. She asked if any of the stolen papers included a contract stating that Harvey would manage his finances. "What contract?" Stephen asked, surprised. His friend was shocked. Stephen had handed over nearly $2 million to someone he barely knew without even requesting any written agreement. Stephen's friends tried to reason with him and pointed out that something seemed suspicious about Harvey. But Stephen always brushed off their concerns. Things escalated to the point where Stephen was left with no means of livelihood at all. The last time a friend tried to talk to Stephen was in early May. They asked directly what Stephen planned to do about the situation. Stephen finally admitted that he needed to speak with Harvey, demand answers, find out where his money was and how he could access it. "I will get answers to these questions," Stephen assured his friend. After that, he disappeared and was never seen alive again. The police obviously needed to talk to Harvey Morrow, and they knew where to find him. Harvey had recently acquired a beautiful yacht, which he was meticulously refurbishing. It was a luxurious 22-meter vessel, suitable even for a round-the-world journey. Shortly after Stephen and Harvey met, the yacht began transforming as if by magic. Teakwood decking, large TVs, fireplaces, a gourmet kitchen, art pieces, a new navigation system, and stainless steel railings. The yacht was undergoing spectacular changes. Oddly enough, Stephen was enthusiastic about the yacht's renovation. He told his friends that Harvey planned to set sail around the world on the yacht with his wife Deborah. Harvey had invited Stephen to join the crew as a chef. Stephen eagerly agreed, and in November 2003, he moved aboard the yacht. He planned to take additional courses to qualify as a yacht chef. The voyage was expected to begin in 2 or 3 years. Once the renovations were complete, and the yacht was stocked with supplies and equipment. Incidentally, the yacht was the last place Stephen was ever seen alive. On May 25, 2006, 7 days into the investigation, detectives obtained a search warrant and headed to San Pedro, where the yacht was docked. However, the yacht was empty and immaculately clean, as though no one had ever lived there, despite detectives knowing that Stephen had resided on the vessel. Officers searched for evidence linking the deceased to the yacht, personal belongings, perhaps blood, but found nothing. They were also interested in the vessel's electronic equipment, especially the GPS device. Unfortunately, all they found was the user manual for the GPS navigator. The device itself was missing, which was particularly disappointing because GPS systems record and store all movements made by the vessel. Detectives were eager to find it, as it could immediately reveal whether the yacht had been near the island where Stephen's body was discovered. Finally, the officers found an expense ledger in which Harvey had recorded how much money he had spent refurbishing the yacht, over $2 million. Roughly the same amount Stephen had inherited. It appeared that Harvey had used Stephen's money to make his luxurious yacht even more opulent, while Stephen was left penniless. The police left the yacht almost empty-handed, frustrated that they hadn't caught Harvey. However, employees of the yacht club informed them that they hadn't missed him. In fact, Harvey had been there, but as soon as he saw the police, he jumped into his car and sped away. An innocent man wouldn't run, confirming that detectives were on the right track. The hunt for the suspect began. The police contacted Harvey's mobile carrier and discovered that after leaving Los Angeles, Harvey had driven to Las Vegas where the trail went cold. He had destroyed his phone. Further analysis confirmed that both Harvey and Stephen had been on the yacht on the day of the murder, May 4th, 2006. That day at around 1 p.m., Stephen called Harvey's phone. Cell tower data showed Stephen's phone pinging from near the Los Angeles port, but later, around 4 p.m., both phones were together, pinging from a tower on Santa Catalina Island. Experts were able to pinpoint the yacht's location at that time. It was behind the island. Shortly after that, Stephen's phone abruptly stopped functioning. There was another curious detail. Before Stephen's death, Harvey had called him dozens of times a week. But after the murder, Harvey never called him again. The police now had enough evidence to arrest Harvey, but they had no idea where he was. All of Harvey's acquaintances claimed that he was likely on the British Virgin Islands, enjoying life on a large yacht among wealthy companions. Finding him would take a miracle. The police reached out to the media and contacted various government agencies, but they couldn't track down the fugitive. Months passed, and detectives believed Harvey had disappeared without a trace, leaving the guilty party unpunished. But on September 11, 2006, nearly 4 months later, officers from Montana reached out to them with new information. A former police officer, now working at a used car dealership, named Joe Parsitich, had called the Montana Sheriff's Office. Some time ago, a man who introduced himself as Harvey Morrow had walked into the dealership looking for a job. He was hired as a salesman. Initially, there were no complaints about him. However, Joe soon noticed that Harvey was making basic errors in calculations. Odd for someone who claimed to have been a broker and financial consultant. Joe found this strange, but his suspicions grew when he noticed Harvey's car parked at a cheap motel. This contradicted Harvey's claims about where he lived. Joe couldn't understand why someone would lie about such trivial matters. What truly raised red flags were Harvey's stories about his past. Harvey claimed to own a beautiful home on the Gulf of Mexico, but said he had abandoned everything and moved to Montana after a tragic accident involving his wife. According to Harvey, his wife had been on a yacht with friends when a storm capsized the vessel, and no one survived. The alleged tragedy had left him unable to tolerate being near open water. Joe couldn't shake the feeling that something about the story didn't add up. That evening, he went home and turned to Google, hoping to learn more about the incident involving Harvey's wife. Instead, he found a Denver News article stating that Harvey Morrow was wanted in connection with a murder. The former policeman immediately contacted the sheriff's office. Everyone had assumed Harvey would flee to a tropical locale, surrounded by wealthy people. Montana was far from fitting that description, but for a fugitive, it had one strategic advantage. It was close to the Canadian border. Harvey's choice made sense as a clever move. Detectives needed to act with extreme caution, as Harvey could easily cross into Canada if he sensed anything amiss. They relied on Joe to help ensure the arrest was carried out safely and without incident. Given that Stephen had been shot, it was possible Harvey was armed. On the day of the planned arrest, Joe, as the dealership manager, found ways to keep the other salespeople inside the building. When Harvey returned from lunch, Joe asked him to prepare a car for a potential buyer, whom he claimed Harvey had been showing vehicles to earlier. As soon as Harvey stepped outside, Joe called the officers, providing a description of Harvey's appearance and his location. Thanks to this detailed information, the arrest went off without a hitch. Harvey Morrow was quickly and efficiently taken into custody and brought to the local station. During the initial interrogation, Harvey behaved arrogantly, suggesting detectives should direct their questions to Stephen, as if unaware that Stephen's body had been discovered. Ultimately, he demanded a lawyer. Harvey was transferred to Los Angeles to stand trial. Despite the abundance of evidence against him, most of it was circumstantial. The prosecution lacked a crime scene, a murder weapon, or direct witnesses. The case promised to be a challenging one, requiring the prosecution to convince all 12 jurors of Harvey's guilt. In February 2007, the Los Angeles Yacht Club contacted the police. A GPS navigator was found in the yacht club's library, the same model as the manual found on Harvey's yacht. This was the crucial piece of evidence the police had been missing. The navigator revealed that on May 4, 2006, the day of Stephen's murder, Harvey's yacht had left San Pedro, traveled to Santa Catalina Island, reached the backside of the island, circled there for a while, and then quickly returned. The timestamps and movements matched evidence obtained from the cell phone records of Harvey and Stephen. Here's what the police believe happened that May night. Stephen Williams was a kind, open, and extremely trusting man, perhaps too trusting. He believed everything Harvey told him and was eagerly anticipating a wonderful journey. Stephen had been living on the yacht, unaware that it was being renovated with his inheritance. But by the time he realized the truth, it was too late. It's likely that Stephen decided to confront Harvey about his money. When they were behind Santa Catalina Island, Harvey approached Stephen from behind, shot him in the back of the head, and Stephen's body immediately fell overboard. Judging by the GPS navigator, Harvey circled the area briefly, possibly searching for the body, but then, confident in his crime, decided that the ocean currents would take care of the rest and carry the body further out to sea. He returned to San Pedro and the next day calmly went fishing with a friend. The trial began on May 12, 2011. During the opening statements, Harvey's lawyer made a shocking claim. He presented a promissory note allegedly showing that Stephen's father owed money to Harvey's father. In other words, Harvey hadn't stolen Stephen's money, but had simply been repaid a debt, eliminating any motive for murder. Investigators were confident the note was a forgery, but they needed time to examine the signature. The prosecutor requested the judge annul the trial. The second trial began in October 2011. By then, handwriting experts had compared the signature on the note with Stephen's father's genuine signature. They did not match. The note was a forgery. The prosecutor meticulously demonstrated, check by check, how Harvey had drained Stephen's account, spending nearly $2 million over 3 years to upgrade the yacht. The yacht was never intended for a global voyage as Harvey had promised, but was instead equipped to serve as a lavish showroom to bolster Harvey's image as a successful businessman. In reality, Harvey was no financial consultant, but a con artist. True to his con artist nature, Harvey believed he could talk his way out of the situation and took the witness stand. He claimed that there had been a verbal agreement that Stephen would give him his entire inheritance. In a final insult to Stephen's family and friends, Harvey suggested that Stephen had shot himself. Among Harvey's many victims was his second wife, Deborah. A successful banking consultant, Deborah had no idea for 8 years that her husband was a fraud. She had always dreamed of a global voyage, and Harvey convinced her to sell their home in Texas to buy the yacht. For years, Deborah sent him $12,000 a month, cutting back on her own expenses, while Harvey indulged himself and maintained his false image. After Stephen's murder, Deborah learned the devastating truth. She believes Harvey planned to lure both her and Stephen onto the yacht to kill them both, but Stephen's confrontation accelerated the timeline. She also discovered that her dazzling engagement ring was a cheap fake, just like her husband. After a 6-week trial, the jury found Harvey Morrow guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Harvey Morrow will spend the rest of his life in a cramped prison cell, a fitting punishment for a man who valued freedom, luxury, and comfort above all else.
Robin Hood of the 21st century. Instead of Sherwood Forest, he operated in a gated community in Florida. Instead of a horse, he maneuvered through the city streets in a luxurious Mercedes. But what would remain unchanged is his assistance to those who are far less fortunate in life. And so it continued until one fateful day when the well-established scheme went awry. This story begins on September 8, 2014, in Florida. The previous evening, spouses Nan Yao and Jill Su returned from a trip to Malaysia, where Nan Yao had been giving lectures. In the morning, the entomology professor shook off the fatigue from the flight and headed to work at the University of Florida. Jill allowed herself a bit more sleep, but got up around 9:30 when her 20-year-old son, Justin, also left home. He worked a part-time job as a professor's assistant. Shortly after noon, Justin's father called him. He wanted to confirm if the young man was at home. Justin replied that he was at work. His father called him because he noticed something unusual on the surveillance camera in the house. He asked his son to come back and check if everything was all right because the camera suddenly stopped transmitting images. 15 minutes later, Justin had already parked his car at home, entered through the garage, passed the sleeping dog in the corridor, and first checked a camera near the kitchen. However, the camera was missing, leaving only a dangling cable where it used to be connected. Justin knew that only his mother was in the house, and he couldn't fathom why someone would target her and rip the camera out with its wire. The situation was the same with the camera in the living room. As he walked into his room, Justin immediately noticed someone had been rifling through his belongings. Justin, an avid hunter and diver, collected knives, and some were now missing. He heard the sound of running water in the parents' bathroom and headed there. Upon entering the bathroom, he saw it filled with water and blood. His mother's lifeless body floated face down. Justin immediately thought of his father and called him. Nan Yao instructed his son to contact the rescue service, and Justin complied. He informed the dispatcher that his mother had done something to herself, the most rational explanation given what he saw at that moment. However, pulling his mother out of the water, he realized he had misunderstood everything. Her hands and legs were bound, and her body bore multiple wounds. Still on the line with the dispatcher, Justin declared that a murder had occurred. Rushing home, Nan Yao wanted to embrace and comfort his son, who had started having a fit of hysteria, but the officers did not allow him. Nan Yao was not aware of it, but it was the first sign that the police considered his son a suspect. The reason was that a folding knife belonging to Justin was lying near the front door. Another hunting knife, a gift from the mother to the son, became the murder weapon. The police found it at the bottom of the bathtub. There, the criminal also threw an emergency alarm panel. He took with him 2 surveillance cameras. It was also evident that the family's belongings had been rifled through. In the glass back door of the house, there was a hole the size of a doggy door. However, investigators were confident that it was not a burglary gone wrong, but a staged act, and a clumsy one at that, because the hole seemed too small for an adult to squeeze through, and the criminal took nothing besides the cameras. The police believed that the crime occurred in a fit of rage. Usually when a robber breaks into a house, they do not end up delivering more than 20 blows to the victim. Detectives delved into the lives of the victim's family. Nan Yao and Jill first met in Japan when she came as an exchange student, and he was working as a teacher. Afterward, Nan Yao went to the United States to pursue his doctoral degree, while Jill continued her travels in Southeast Asia. Approximately 2 years later, he received a postcard from her, deeply moved to learn that she was in Thailand, volunteering to aid Cambodian refugees. When she returned to America, the two married and adopted a daughter, Amanda. 3 years later, Justin joined the family. Jill not only remained a wonderful mother to her children, but also found the strength and time for volunteer work. She recorded audiobooks for people with visual impairments. There was no doubt that the Su family members loved each other deeply. However, tension arose in the last few months. Justin dropped out of college, which of course displeased his parents. Yet what intrigued the police even more was Jill Su's maiden name, Halliburton. Earl Halliburton had once been one of the wealthiest individuals in the country, amassing his fortune in the oil industry. When Earl passed away, his wealth was distributed among all family members. But the magnate had so many relatives that Jill, Amanda, and Justin received almost nothing. The Su family's bills were paid not by oil, but by termite control, thanks to Nan Yao's invention of an effective termite trap 30 years ago. Even after Jill's death, her share of the inheritance went to her husband, who considered himself quite affluent. All of Jill and Nan Yao's friends attested that the family lived in love and harmony. Just a few hours after Justin found his mother brutally murdered, he sat in the interrogation room at the police station. Several aspects of his story troubled the investigators. Firstly, how could he not immediately recognize it as murder, given the number of stab wounds inflicted on Jill? Moreover, the murder weapon, a knife, belonged to Justin. It seemed odd that the intruder didn't grab a readily available kitchen knife. Justin showed no signs of a struggle, answered all questions calmly, and did not request a lawyer. He explained to detectives that he left for work around 9:30 a.m., returned home at approximately 12:30 p.m. after his father's call, and initially didn't notice anything unusual. Initially, the officers were calm and delicate with Justin, but the tone of the interrogation quickly shifted to accusatory, especially after catching him in lies. He told his father he was at work on the phone but claimed to be at the college library when talking to the police. He later admitted to lying about that, stating he slept in his car in the parking lot. Justin explained he was worried about how his father would react to him sleeping in the car instead of studying or working, so he lied. Then Justin claimed he took another knife with him when he left the car and returned it later.
Clean, this is your only opportunity.
Oh my God.
You understand? Your dad.
What? What did I say to my dad? I lied to my dad. I told him I was going to work.
Later, Justin claimed that as he was getting out of the car, he took another knife with him, but then he returned it to its place. So, after discovering Anne's mother, did he go and put the knife in the car? This, of course, was nonsense, and under pressure, Justin admitted that he had lied again. He didn't take any knife with him. However, Justin insisted from the beginning that the intruder broke into the house to steal something and didn't expect to encounter the homeowner. During breaks between interrogations, when investigators consulted with forensic experts about evidence in Nan Yao, Justin ran around the room, shouting, crying, and begging to be released.
Please let me out.
He was obviously in shock and couldn't calm down. In the adjacent room, Nan Yao heard his son's agony, but couldn't do anything because it was his turn to answer questions. After all, he was the one who raised the alarm that day. Nan Yao explained that around 12:15, he decided to check the surveillance cameras in the house. Unexpectedly, he saw an unfamiliar person, a fleeting figure in a mask that appeared for just a moment, heading towards the kitchen corner. As soon as the figure disappeared from view, the camera feed was lost. Nan Yao thought it could be his son. Justin sometimes deliberately blocked the cameras so his father couldn't see anything when friends visited, as he did 2 days ago when his parents were in Malaysia. But Justin told his father he was at work. Worried because Jill didn't answer calls, Nan Yao became anxious and asked his son to go home. Essentially, Nan Yao only saw the eyes of the intruder and described him as a tall and slender young man. Detectives couldn't help but notice that Justin fit this description. They seemed to be setting father and son against each other. They pointed out to Nan Yao that Justin matched his description. They told Justin that his father suspected him of murder. However, even when Justin was on edge and unsure of what to believe, Nan Yao never bought into it. Regardless of the tactics the investigators chose, they consistently pressured Justin for 11 grueling hours. But Justin maintained his innocence, requested a polygraph test, and insisted that they would come to apologize when the case was solved.
When you guys find out you're wrong, I hope you come and say sorry to me, man, or something.
If there was anything that could help the young man, it was the image of the intruder seen by his father. However, the hitch was that the Su family had agreed to a 2-week trial period during which recordings from their cameras would be saved, and this period ended exactly 2 days before the crime. As the couple was in Malaysia and likely forgot to renew this service, there were simply no recordings. In other words, Nan Yao saw the real-time image, and when the image disappeared, it was gone forever. However, other detectives reviewed the surveillance camera footage near the entrance of the gated community where the family lived. They confirmed that Justin left at 9:15 and didn't reappear until 3 hours later when he returned home at his father's request. In other words, the murder occurred while Justin was not at home. After hours of accusations and pressure at the police station, they simply opened the door and allowed him to go home. Waiting for him behind the door was his father, who did his best to comfort his son. Unlike the police, he never believed in his son's guilt for a moment. In any case, Justin provided the police with a new lead that opened up an entirely new direction for the investigation. 2 days before the parents returned from Malaysia, Justin organized a party. The company was not very large, about 25 people around the age of 20, but now the list of people to be interrogated significantly increased. They were all invited to the station, and DNA and fingerprints were taken. No one objected. By that time, everyone already knew what had happened to Justin's mother and were willing to help. They mentioned that they were aware of the cameras because Justin had warned them and asked them to behave properly. Almost all the guests were his old friends, but not everyone. Some suggested that the police should pay attention to a guy with a bad reputation who had previously been arrested by the police. When officers arrived at his place, he admitted that he was expecting them. He confirmed that he had been arrested before, but for controlled substances, not robbery. His DNA was already in the database, so he had no problem providing it again. The young man had an alibi, and there were no scratches or signs of struggle on his body. In general, the police spoke with 30 people, and besides this guy, no one had legal issues. It seemed like the investigation was at a standstill, but that was not the case. Throughout this time, forensic experts were comparing DNA found at the crime scene, and after 9 days of investigation, news came from the laboratory. They had a match, and incredibly, the suspect's name was in the database. The DNA belonged to 20-year-old Diante Rezeles. Detectives pondered whether there might be an innocent reason for Diante being in the house. Perhaps he knew Justin, who was a year younger. The detective called Justin and listed 3 names, 2 of which were made up to test him. He didn't recognize any of them, including Diante. Diante grew up and lived near the Sioux family home. However, unlike Justin, he was raised by a single mother earning a minimum wage. Diante was not a typical child. He excelled in school, surprisingly well-read, and teachers loved him. However, by adolescence, he became bored with mundane lessons and got involved with a bad crowd. By the age of 18, he had been arrested 8 times, mostly for robberies. His modus operandi sounded familiar to the detectives. He would rent expensive cars and disguise himself to explain his presence in affluent neighborhoods. Diante targeted luxurious mansions in gated communities near the water, infiltrating homes through openings in rear glass doors and disabling surveillance cameras when possible. However, he never attacked the homeowners. If he thought someone was at home, he would flee. In his neighborhood, Diante was liked and considered a Robin Hood figure. He generously shared his loot, paying for others' electricity bills and rent. He could spend $1,000 on diapers and food for single mothers. Perhaps this is why no one believed or wanted to believe he was capable of the accusations against him. On July 15, 2016, almost 2 years after Jill's murder, an unexpected turn of events occurred during what started as a routine court hearing. The prisoner accused of first-degree murder, restrained in handcuffs and shackles, managed to escape from the crowded courtroom. This prisoner was none other than Diante Rezeles. How did he pull off such an escape? When investigators listened to the recordings of the prisoner's phone calls, they realized the plan was orchestrated by teenagers. Everything was set up that morning. The key was to obtain the handcuff key. Diante had weakened the prison jumpsuit to make it easier to run, and he wore regular clothes underneath. When he was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and shackles, another inmate shielded him while removing the chain from his waist, allowing Diante's hands some movement. He entered the courtroom, surrounded by other prisoners awaiting their hearings. Undoing the handcuffs, he waited for his accomplices to be ready. His twin cousins, acting as Diante's eyes and ears, were also present in the courtroom. As soon as a car approached, one cousin signaled to the other, who then signaled to Diante. When new prisoners were brought into the courtroom, Diante simply stood up and ran. Once outside, he discarded the prison jumpsuit and, knowing the route, which his accomplices had undoubtedly described to him, he sprinted out of the building to a waiting car. Days passed, 2, 3, 4. The fugitive eluded officers, and the reward for his capture grew to $50,000. His family and friends refused to assist the police. On the contrary, they did not believe in his guilt and did what they could to protect him. People couldn't comprehend how a robber, who avoided confrontation with homeowners, had evolved into a killer, assaulting a woman with more than 20 knife wounds. Yet, someone decided to turn in Diante, revealing he was hiding in a motel. 6 days after the escape, Diante Rezeles was captured. He offered no resistance during the arrest. In the subsequent months, all 8 friends who aided Diante's escape were apprehended and charged. This demonstrated Diante's intelligence and extraordinary charisma, convincing these individuals to risk their freedom for him. After his arrest, Diante wrote a letter to the judge from whose trial he escaped, apologizing for the escape. He explained that he had to free himself to find evidence of his innocence. However, when he was apprehended, he was merely sitting in a hotel, interacting with friends, and visiting adult websites. The trial began in 2021, and as with everything in this story, it concluded with an incredible twist. The prosecution was convinced of the case because Deontay could not explain the presence of his DNA on the three crucial elements of the crime: the belt used to tie the victim, one of Justin's knives, and the back door. The version of events seemed to suggest itself. Deontay broke into the house with the intention of robbery. Suddenly, he encountered the homeowner and a struggle ensued. At some point, the woman tried to escape onto the street through the front door. According to a neighbor of the Sue family, it was noon when she heard a scream from the neighbor's house. She managed to notice an object at the front door that sharply moved inside the house. She thought it was a dog. However, investigators and the prosecutor believed it was Jill screaming when Deontay dragged her back into the house. After that, he must have struck her with Justin's knife, as the sharp protrusion on the murder weapon exactly matched the head injury on Jill. When the woman lost consciousness, the perpetrator took her to the bathtub, tied her up, and inflicted knife wounds. Despite detectives initially thinking the criminal wanted to create the appearance of a robbery, the evidence actually matched an interrupted burglary. Additionally, Deontay's escape from the courtroom and his attempts to persuade friends to provide him with an alibi worked against him. Deontay bribed a prison guard to get a phone, thinking he had succeeded. However, all his calls were, of course, monitored by the police. The defendant asked his friend to lie for him, saying he was in Georgia, not Florida, on the day of the murder. Even though Deontay's phone records proved he was in Florida, he tried to find an explanation for the main prosecution evidence and asked his friend to lie about the DNA. He suggested his friend pretend someone attacked Deontay, cut him, and took his blood to leave at the crime scene. The guy reasoned that accusing a person who is no longer alive would prevent further questioning. However, he didn't know that forensic experts hadn't found his blood at the crime scene and obtained DNA from his other biological materials. It seemed like the evidence was indisputable, but the jury deliberated for 5 days and found Deontay Razilis guilty of involuntary manslaughter, not first-degree murder as he was charged. It was a blow to Jill's family, but that was the jury's decision. Or was it? The judge began asking each member of the jury one by one if they agreed with the verdict. It was a standard procedure in court. Therefore, the unexpected answer from the jury foreperson was surprising. She said no. Later, she explained her decision. When the jury deliberated, they couldn't ignore the evidence against Deontay, but 3 people were against convicting the pleasant young man of first-degree murder. They argued and argued, eventually compromising on involuntary manslaughter. However, when the jury foreperson saw the reaction of the defense attorneys in the courtroom, clapping Deontay on the back, smiling, giggling, and congratulating each other on the victory, she declared that she disagreed with the verdict. In her opinion, Deontay deserved a more severe punishment. The trial ended in nothing. A few months later, there was a retrial with new jurors, and this time, the defendant was found guilty of first-degree murder. Involuntary manslaughter meant that Deontay would spend a maximum of 15 years in prison. For first-degree murder, he faced the death penalty or life imprisonment. The Sue family asked the prosecutors to waive the death penalty because that's what Jill wouldn't have wanted. Deontay was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This case was unusual from the very beginning to the end. The police claim their task is to be the voice of the victim. However, it seems they didn't think through this statement. After all, Justin's mother would hardly want to accuse her son of her murder. The most horrifying part is that the police actions were used by Deontay's lawyers. For them, Justin was the perfect alternative suspect. Allegedly, they had a fight with his mother, and the son killed her with his knife. Detectives pressured and harassed Justin, hoping to record a confession, but all they captured were vehement false accusations against the young man, which became a problem for the prosecution. But the most astonishing aspect of this case was how successfully Deontay manipulated people. Overall, he coerced at least 16 individuals into illegal actions to help him escape and fabricate alibis, including 3 young women, each of whom considered herself his girlfriend. Many still do not believe in his innocence, assuming that the police found a scapegoat, and Deontay would never exhibit such cruelty. Currently, the young man is in prison, hoping that his release will be attributed not to appeals or exemplary behavior, but to Kim Kardashian, who is known for her advocacy for prisoners' rights. This is an excellent indicator that Deontay might never regain his freedom.
case seemed clear. A ship was found in the North Sea, partially burned and with no signs of life aboard, not a trace of the crew. The deck was covered in blood. The only surviving sailor was discovered in a lifeboat with suitcases full of cash. The sailor appeared utterly composed and unconcerned, but kept changing his testimony, further complicating the investigation. Will Danish and German investigators be able to uncover what really happened aboard the cargo ship Barbel? This is one of those cases where the suspect seems obvious, and the motive is clear, but proving their guilt turns out to be anything but easy. Moreover, the case is riddled with uncertainties that cast doubt on the seemingly inevitable conclusion of their culpability. 27 years ago, the small cargo ship Barbel departed from London carrying a load of rapeseed for the Rostock Company in northern Germany. Barbel was considered a fairly modern ship for its time. Its hull was built in 1986 by the Danish shipbuilders Schiepswerf Damen Gorinkum and was completed and delivered to its owner and captain, Heinrich Telkmann, in 1989. On Sunday, August 15, 1993, 50-year-old Heinrich called his wife, who was also named Barbel. In fact, he had named the ship after her. He made the call around 7 a.m., telling her the ship had reached the Thames estuary and that he expected to return to Germany by evening. The Barbel departed London for Brunsbüttel with 6 strong and experienced crew members on board. In addition to the German captain Heinrich Telkmann, there were 5 Russians: engineer Mikhail Mikhailov, sailor Vladislav Bogdan, sailor Andrei Lapin, first mate Viktor Varenko, and cook Anatoly Smolyak. When Heinrich failed to return home at the promised time, Barbel tried to reach him on Monday but got no response. Nothing was known until 10:45 a.m. on Wednesday, when Danish fishermen on small boats discovered 2 drifting life rafts approximately 157 kilometers west of Esbjerg. One raft was empty, while fisherman Søren Larsen found sailor Andrei Lapin in the other. The ship itself was located shortly afterward, and the reason for the captain's silence became immediately clear. There was a significant amount of blood on board, which someone had evidently tried to wash away. Someone had also attempted to ignite 3 fires throughout the ship, using diesel fuel to improve flammability. But none of the fires had succeeded. The ship bore signs of a violent struggle. The captain's cabin was ransacked. The ship's cash register lay empty on the floor, and fragments of hair, skin, and even skull were scattered across the vessel. It was presumed that someone had used the ship's crane to lift the dead from the lower deck and throw their bodies into the sea. The only trace of the captain remaining on board was a photograph of his daughter, left on the table. This was the state of affairs until September 14, 1993, when fishermen discovered Heinrich's body. None of the other missing crew members were ever found. Speculation arose that the perpetrator had tied metal to their bodies, found on board, before throwing them overboard. The sole survivor of the crew, Andrei Lapin, claimed that a fire broke out on the ship and that he managed to escape by jumping into a life raft. However, Danish fisherman Søren Larsen, who rescued Lapin, was the first to express doubts about the survivor's story. We were surprised that, despite the panic and confusion that must have ensued on board, the Russians still found time to pack his blanket, pillow, and 2 suitcases full of papers into the life raft, Larsen said. According to German media, Lapin had a down jacket, pillows, his old passport, 6 cans of canned peaches, some cola, and 2 suitcases with papers and documents on the lifeboat, as well as 60,000 Deutsche Marks, nearly $53,885.09. According to Barbel Telkmann, the wife of the missing captain and ship owner, her husband always paid wages in cash. On the other hand, Lapin told the police that this was his own saved money, which he intended to use to buy a car. A more serious accusation was that Barbel claimed Lapin was wearing her husband's watch when he was found. But if his motive was robbery, why commit 5 murders when he was already planning to flee the ship on a life raft? Suspicion also arose when Lapin initially refused to board the rescue helicopter summoned for him. Reports stated that he was entirely calm and unconcerned about the situation, which seemed unbelievable considering he had spent at least 2 days adrift in the North Sea, hundreds of nautical miles from land. Could it be that he truly witnessed events as he described and was traumatized by what he saw? Or was he too preoccupied with constructing his version of what had happened aboard the ship when he was found? He seemed cold-blooded, added Danish fisherman Paul Gottfredsen, describing the rescued man. Anyone else would have asked about the other sailors. This man was freezing. He seemed completely calm and entirely unconcerned. It was also unclear why Barbel was found drifting approximately 240 kilometers north of the actual London to Brunsbüttel route after it went missing. The Russian could not explain that to us, said Danish criminal investigator Borge Bago Hansen. Initially, Lappin told Danish investigators that he had escaped the fire while the other crew members drowned. Later, he changed his story, claiming that a dispute over pay and working conditions erupted between Heinrich and the sailors. According to him, 2 mutinous sailors used axes to kill Heinrich, and 2 other sailors then threatened him, forcing Lappin to kill both of them in self-defense. As he naturally assumed that no one would believe his story, he decided to dispose of all the evidence and took the money to hand it over to the families of the missing men. The Russian sailor was brought before an investigating judge in Esbjerg, Denmark. Danish Commissioner Borge Bago Hansen stated, "These people were killed within 48 hours, but we still don't know how." On August 19, 1993, Lappin was charged with arson and the murder of 5 people and was deported from Denmark to Germany on December 13, 1993. Since both the ship and the captain were German, however, neither the Danish police nor the German court could disprove André Lappin's account, despite all their efforts to establish his guilt as a cold-blooded murderer. The trial began on September 5, 1994. Lappin had refused to speak with the German police before the trial, but appeared at the Osnabrück District Court neatly dressed and answered all the questions posed to him. At the trial, his version of events changed once again. This time, Lappin claimed that he and the ship's helmsman had joined forces to investigate what had happened to the captain. When the men found Heinrich dead after being attacked by other sailors on board, Lappin managed to escape, while the helmsman was less fortunate. The mutinous sailors captured and killed him. Witnessing the killers fighting amongst themselves, Lappin hid at the bottom of a staircase, which allowed him to take them out one by one. Killing the men with their own axes, he then tried to dispose of the evidence and attempted to bring the Barbel to shore, though he couldn't navigate the ship alone. His original story about a fire breaking out was a lie because he feared no one would believe him. The sailor insisted that this time he was telling the whole truth. Lappin's lawyer, Thomas Klein, added that the atmosphere on the ship had been oppressive. The captain showed little respect for the crew, and the sailors had conflicts among themselves. While testifying in court, Lappin revealed that his knowledge of the Battle of Thermopylae had helped him survive. Klein recalled his client quoting Chekhov and Tolstoy in conversations with a psychiatric expert. The 28-year-old was not only highly educated, but also had remarkable composure. This was confirmed by Lappin's second lawyer, Jens Meggers. Partly for this reason, both attorneys decided it was appropriate to let their client testify in his own defense during the trial. Lappin fully took advantage of the opportunity. 3 hours before the verdict was announced, the sailor once again denied all charges. He reiterated that he had intended to give the money to the victims' families and had disposed of the bodies and staged the fire out of fear that no one would believe him. Incidentally, in this regard, he was entirely correct, which was why he had concocted the story about a fire when he first made his statement to investigators. The case attracted widespread attention, not only in Denmark and Germany, but also in other countries. Soon there were offers to write books or make films based on the real events that had unfolded in the North Sea. It was no surprise, as the case had all the elements of a gripping crime thriller: hatred, mutiny, dramatic murder theories, and a charismatic defendant. The press followed the bloody details of the cargo ship massacre trial closely. Interest in the case was fueled in every conceivable way. Lappin's lawyer recounted how a well-known tabloid acquired a painting the sailor had created while in prison and, after showing it to a psychologist, asked the question, could the artist who painted this be a murderer? For public opinion, the case was clear-cut. 5 of the 6 sailors aboard the cargo ship Barbel had died, murdered. The 6th sailor was found days later in a life raft with a stash of money and another man's watch. He was accused of 5 murders and arson. Yet the court's decision, a verdict of not guilty. Is he guilty? Only Lappin knows, said lawyer Jens Meggers. On February 3, 1995, Lappin walked out of court a free man due to insufficient evidence for a conviction. He was even allowed to keep the 60,000 marks, now claiming he had earned the money by selling traditional religious icons from Russia. On July 30, 1996, the Bundesgerichtshof, Federal Court of Justice of Germany, the highest court for criminal and civil cases, announced that no further charges would be brought against Lappin. The families of Mikhail Mikhailov, Vladislav Bogdan, Viktor Varenko, and Anatoly Smoyak have yet to receive any definitive answers about the fate of their loved ones. There are many curious aspects of this case that make it difficult to believe the answer lies on the surface, leading one to consider that Andre might be telling an incredible but truthful story. The timeline of the ship's planned voyage, from Sunday morning to the same evening, and the fact that Heinrich didn't answer his wife's call on Monday suggests that whatever happened to the crew likely occurred on Sunday, August 15th, according to Danish investigators, almost certainly within 48 hours of the ship's departure from London. While it seems most likely that Lapin was responsible for the disappearance of Heinrich and the crew, as well as the attempted arson, the timeline for his plan makes absolutely no sense. Why attack the 5 other sailors and the captain just after the ship left port, instead of waiting until it was close to its destination? Or, considering that Lapin was hired on August 9th, why not steal the ship's cash while it was docked in London between August 10th and 15 and escape with the money then? Lapin almost certainly lied about taking the money to give it to the victims' families, as he claimed, but that doesn't necessarily mean he killed the 5 other men to access the cash. It's worth noting that Lapin came from Kaliningrad, a region of Russia on the Baltic Sea bordering Poland and Lithuania. One theory suggested that he might have believed he could navigate the ship across the North Sea through Danish waters and back home. However, he lacked the necessary knowledge or experience to do so. It's hard to believe that an intelligent young man would think he could sail a ship the size of the Barbel without first learning how to operate it. Even if this was Lapin's plan, he would have needed to be confident he could overpower 5 other men, strong, experienced sailors, without them fighting back enough to injure or kill him and thwart his escape. As for the items he managed to pack into the life raft, if we believe his final version of events, it seems plausible that before attempting to start a fire to destroy the evidence, he did indeed have time to pack essential belongings into the lifeboat. Regardless of what truly happened that August day, the exact chain of events and the reasons behind them remain a mystery to this day. Interestingly, according to media reports, after his release, Lapin attempted to get a job on the Barbel through Heinrich's widow, who had inherited the ship. He did not get the job. In August 2018, to mark the 25th anniversary of the Barbel crew's grim mystery, the Danish-language regional newspaper Jydske Vestkysten dedicated several pages to revisiting the case. Reporter Mark Michael Hedde succeeded in conducting a phone interview with Lapin, the sailor who had walked out of a German courtroom a free man years earlier. During the interview, Lapin was at the Arctic Emergency Rescue Center in Murmansk. Now 53 years old, he shared that he lived in Kaliningrad with his wife and 2 children. He worked as a rescue diver and had participated in more than 250 rescue operations. In his spare time, he painted. Among other things, Lapin told the reporter, "There is nothing pleasant about having to kill, and I would have preferred to avoid it. You see, I feel sorry for the families of those I killed, but I do not regret what I did. If I hadn't killed those 2, I wouldn't be alive today."
This is the story of April and Michael, a married couple with 3 children, a loving family, devoted friends, and a typical enemy. An enemy that will tear apart this strong, ideal family, force the husband against the wife, and the father against the son. This story will end in chaos, violence, and murder, leaving only one question unanswered. Who are we facing? A fortunate murderer or an innocent victim? April was born on December 1978. The girl endured a difficult childhood. Her parents abused alcohol and illegal substances. Sometimes her mother could disappear for weeks, leaving April and her 2 younger twin brothers, Chris and Michael, behind. April did everything possible to take care of her younger brothers, changing their diapers and feeding them, even though she was still a child herself. Soon, the grandparents couldn't cope and took the children under their care. They genuinely loved the children and took good care of them. But being elderly, they struggled with the 3 lively kids. Therefore, they had to turn to the state's Child Association for help. They placed the boys in the Owenby foster family, while April stayed with her grandparents. The boys regularly visited their grandmother, grandfather, and sister. But at the age of 9, April moved in with her brothers to keep the bond between them strong. The Owenby family lived in the town of Eclectic, Alabama, where the girl blossomed. At the age of 17, she met the love of her life, Jesse Michael Holton, whom everyone called Mike. The young couple attended the same school, shared a passion for music, and quickly became friends. Everyone described them as a beautiful couple, so it came as no surprise when, at the age of 19, April became Mrs. Michael Holton. A year after their marriage, they welcomed their first son, and 2 years later, they had 3 children, Madison, Hayden, and Kyle. The dependence on her parents had shattered April's childhood, and she had always dreamed of a stable family life. In Michael, she found someone who fully shared her dreams. April took care of the children while Michael provided for the family by working as a firefighter. On September 11, 2001, he volunteered to go to New York to help people after the explosions. In 2003, at just 25 years old, Michael became the chief of the fire department, the youngest in the city's history. He also underwent training to work as a paramedic. In his spare time, Michael coached school football and baseball teams, while April never missed any of her son's competitions. Overall, the couple actively participated in the life of the town, which made them well known and loved by all. Everything was going well, but one night in 2004, something seemingly insignificant changed their entire happy family life. During a shift, Michael injured his back. In the following weeks, his condition worsened. The doctor prescribed painkillers, but warned him that the pain would only subside if he gave his back the necessary rest. However, as a paramedic, Michael couldn't afford to do so. He continued to work tirelessly, taking medication, and as often happens, became dependent on painkillers. In 2010, the mayor of Eclectic resigned, and Michael had an idea. He believed he could contribute more to the city from an office position, especially as it wouldn't require as much physical exertion. In 2012, at the age of 33, Michael Holton became the mayor. However, a year later, he began to suffer from an unknown illness, manifesting in epileptic seizures. Fortunately, the seizures soon subsided, unlike April's concerns. She suspected that the seizures might be a result of Michael overdosing on painkillers. Furthermore, she knew that Michael's back no longer hurt, and the doctor had stopped prescribing him medication. This meant he was obtaining them illegally. Unfortunately, the problem not only affected Michael's physical health, but also his mood swings. April tried not to complain about the family problems, but her brothers noticed that Michael began to treat her differently, less gently than before. He became verbally abusive and controlling, a completely different person. Moreover, Michael's addiction affected the family's finances. In 2014, they lost their home, yet Michael continued to borrow money from his mother and spend it on pills. April feared they would lose their medical insurance if he got caught and arrested. She demanded that her husband resign as mayor. He complied and returned to work as a paramedic at the fire department. Despite the difficulties, April tried to support her husband. She knew the troubles associated with substance abuse and didn't want her family to face the same difficulties she experienced as a child. She still believed that Michael could overcome his addiction. But then another problem hit the family. The parents found out that their eldest son, 16-year-old Madison, had gotten involved with a group of kids who used cannabis. While April was extremely upset and asked her brother Chris to talk to Madison, Michael saw no point in punishing the boy. He told his wife that it wasn't such a big problem because many teenagers dabbled in marijuana. Hearing this, April realized that she could no longer help her husband, but she could still protect their children from addiction. By April 2016, she and her sons had moved to a new home in a neighboring town, a 20-minute drive from Eclectic. By August, she had filed for divorce. The children split their time between the two families, spending time with both their father and mother. Michael struggled greatly with the separation. He confided in April's best friend and admitted that he feared his wife would start dating someone else. However, she assured him that April just wanted to focus on raising the children and was doing everything in their best interest. At the same time, April warned her son that if he didn't give up his harmful habit, he would no longer live in her house. But within a week, he disobeyed, and his mother sent him to live with his father. Michael convinced April that he agreed with her about Madison, and he was not okay with his son using cannabis. April sincerely believed that in Michael's house, their son should adhere to the same strict rules as in hers. But in reality, things were quite different. Michael's painkiller supply ran out, and he had to take an unexpected step. He asked his son if he could get them for him, and the boy replied that he could. Thus, father and son found themselves bound by a dark secret that they hoped would never come to light. On September 11, 2016, April answered a call from Madison's friend's mother. The woman informed her that the previous night, the 17-year-old boy had hosted a party at his father's house. She was extremely displeased that her son had come home at least partially intoxicated. Upset, April drove home to Mike's to address the situation. While she was en route, she also called Mike. Mike worked shifts, and he hadn't been home all night, so he knew nothing about what had happened. When he arrived home, the house was turned upside down after the teenage party, with traces of alcohol and more. The angry father sent his son a message to come home immediately. When April entered Mike's house, she found her son sitting on the couch with his hands handcuffed behind his back. This was Mike's decision to punish him for disobedience. Mike had already called the police, and an officer knocked on the door of the house at 4:28 p.m. He spoke with the parents, the distraught Madison, and took pictures of the house. The parents asked the officer to arrest the boy so he could appear before a judge and answer for his actions. However, it was Sunday, and there would be no judge until Monday. Therefore, Mike agreed to take his son to the station the next day. As the officer later recounted, Mike and April didn't argue with each other and agreed that their son needed to be disciplined. The policeman left at 4:48 p.m., and the parents went to the bedroom to discuss the situation while their son continued to sit on the couch. However, just 11 minutes later, another call came in to the emergency services. This time it was from Mike's neighbor, who reported that a terrified, handcuffed Madison had rushed to his house, screaming that his father had attacked his mother, and he was worried something might happen to her because his father was armed. The neighbor called 911 and ran to the neighbor's house. He knocked on the door but only heard April's moans. Madison remained outside as the neighbor walked into the bedroom and saw a horrifying scene. Michael and April lay on the floor in a pool of blood. A gun lay beside the man's feet. Michael was dead on the spot, but April was still breathing. She was immediately taken to the hospital, where she died from a gunshot wound to the head. Madison told the police that after the officer left, his parents went into the bedroom where they started arguing loudly. Suddenly, his mother began calling for help. Madison burst into the room, breaking down the door. He saw his father holding his mother in a chokehold with one hand, holding a gun to her head. The boy rushed out of the house to call for help. At first, the police had no doubts that Mike shot his wife and then himself. However, gradually some details emerged that made investigators question this theory. They wondered if Madison could have killed Michael and April. Firstly, Madison claimed to have broken down the door and burst into the bedroom, but police found no signs of damage on the door. Secondly, he claimed not to have heard any gunshots, but experiments showed that even a gunshot from inside the house would have been audible from the neighboring door. Forensic experts examined residue on his hands and found none, but the police explained that sometimes the type of gun used in this case wouldn't leave traces of residue. Additionally, Madison remained handcuffed when the police arrived, which initially seemed to support his innocence. However, he knew that the key was on the coffee table in the living room, indicating that Madison could have taken the key, freed himself, committed the crime, put the handcuffs back on, and then run to the neighbor's house. Moreover, Madison remained relatively calm for someone who had just witnessed such a scene, which didn't sit well with the sheriff. Madison explained that he couldn't cry because he was in a lot of pain and was constantly replaying what happened in his head. Nevertheless, the sheriff decided that some time in jail might make him talk, so he was detained in connection with the events of the previous night. Meanwhile, the pathologist examined the bodies and concluded that the cause of death for both was homicide. The bullets were fired from close range. April was shot on the right side of her head. The bullet also hit her finger, indicating that she was trying to shield herself when she was shot. In Mike's case, the bullet entered the back of his head from the left side and exited on the right. This meant he must have been holding the gun with his left hand, even though he was right-handed, and pressed it against the back of his head. The report from the medical examiner convinced the police that Madison was involved in the deaths of Mike and April. With 3 people in the house and 2 dead, the conclusion seemed clear. Madison was charged with the murder of his parents. At the preliminary hearing, the judge ruled that there was enough evidence for the teenager to stand trial before a jury. He set bail at $1 million, which, of course, the family did not have. A year later, by December 2017, the bail amount was reduced. His uncle Chris and his wife borrowed the required amount and posted bail. The boy was released just before Christmas, which was a wonderful gift for April's relatives. In turn, Mike's family sided with the police. They believed that if Madison was charged so quickly, it meant the police were sure of his guilt. However, April's family, including her parents and brothers, was not ready to accept everything at face value. And the more information emerged before the start of the trial, the more questions it raised. First of all, it is known that the bullets were fired from close range. However, there was not a drop of blood found on Madison's clothing. Could he have changed his clothes? Yes, he could have. But it's important to remember that all of this happened within 11 minutes. Even if we assume he knew where the gun was, he would have had to remove the handcuffs behind his back with a small key, commit the crime, wash up, change clothes, hide the blood-stained clothing where no one would find it, put the handcuffs back on, and run to the neighbor's house. All within 11 minutes. That seems unlikely. Furthermore, after the neighbor's call to emergency services, the same officer who was in the house before arrived at the scene. He confirmed that he did not notice any signs that Madison had changed his clothes or attempted to clean up in the house. Then, the toxicology report showed that there was a cocktail of different strong drugs in Mike's system. 4 different very strong painkillers that he had been regularly taking for 10 years, which could have affected his condition. The police did not find full fingerprints on the weapon, but there was only April's DNA on the trigger. Finally, on Mike's neck and cheek from the right side, the pathologist found several scratches, as well as bruises on his left shoulder. As for April, bruises covered the inner surface of her thighs, chest, and the right side of her face. And under her nails, they found Mike's DNA. This suggests that April scratched her husband while he was holding her in a chokehold, and if he was holding his wife, he was likely doing so with his stronger right hand, while holding the gun in his left. Moreover, acquaintances claimed that Mike was actually ambidextrous, meaning he was equally proficient with both hands. Nonetheless, the coroner's report indicates a struggle and contradicts the police version that Madison suddenly burst into the room and shot the two. Additional information emerged about Mike's behavior in the months and weeks leading up to the crime. He couldn't come to terms with the idea that April might start dating someone else. After the breakup, a friend of his wife assured him that April had no intention of doing so. But a week before the murder, Mike found out that April had entered into a new relationship. He panicked, cried constantly, and called his wife repeatedly. The man wrote a letter to his wife in which he assured her that he couldn't go on living knowing she was with someone else. Even more revealing was Mike's diary, in which he practically bid farewell to all family members. It suggested that he took the breakup very badly, and just a week before the murder, he was contemplating ending his life on his own terms. It was interesting that Madison repeatedly asked investigators if he could undergo a lie detector test to prove his innocence, but he was not allowed to do so. The boy's story never changed, and he remained steadfast in his account of what happened. He was offered deals, but he refused each time because he was not going to confess to something he didn't do. As for his lack of emotions after the deaths of Mike and April, this should never be the basis for accusing someone of murder, especially a teenager. Prior to this, the biggest problem in his life was his parents' punishment for marijuana use, but in an instant, he lost Mike and April and found himself accused of their murder. Everything happened. On October 22, 2018, Madison was preparing to appear in court. However, just before the start of the trial, the district attorney announced that the charges against the teenager would be dropped. The entire case was based on it being a double homicide. But in reality, the pathologist could not completely rule out the possibility that Michael shot himself. The district attorney stated, "Our job as prosecutors is to seek the truth and deliver justice. When we cannot ascertain the truth, it is impossible to achieve justice." He explained that there are 3 theories of what happened. Madison killed Michael and April. Madison witnessed his father killing his mother and shot him out of revenge. Or Michael shot his wife and then himself. All 3 theories have merit, and there is no evidence that definitively disproves or proves any of them. The prosecutor added that if new evidence of Madison's guilt emerges, he will face a jury trial and be found guilty. But if the jury acquits him now, and he is guilty, he cannot be tried again, and he will enjoy freedom with impunity for the rest of his days. Today, Madison admits that going through all the trials was helped by his maternal family, who did not turn away from him in difficult times. He hopes to mend relationships with his brothers and relatives from his father's side, and does not plan to file a lawsuit against the city police, at least because it was one of the conditions for dropping the charges. He acknowledges that if it weren't for the time spent alone with his thoughts in prison, he would have continued to party and hang out with a bad crowd. The days of throwing noisy parties are far behind him now. Madison has completed his final year of high school and plans to attend college, become a lawyer, and defend people in need. But before that, he decided to fulfill his long-standing dream and joined the army. The young man married a girl named Diana, became a father, and is absolutely happy. However, Madison does not deny that he is constantly haunted by the fear that the sheriff will try to accuse him again of the murders of Mike and April. He cannot even discuss all the details of what happened because he has not been proven innocent. He simply was not charged.
As a rule, the main mystery in a murder case is identifying who committed it. In this instance, however, we know from the very beginning who pulled the trigger. The question is, was it a terrible mistake or a cold-blooded murder? Linda and Patrick Duffy had been happily married until April 26, 2007, when Linda made a panicked call to Los Angeles Emergency Services. When police officers arrived, they found Patrick Duffy on the couch. His left hand rested in his pocket, and his right knee was propped on a cushion. The man's position appeared comfortable, relaxed, as if he were simply asleep. But he wasn't. He was dead. His head, along with the couch, the walls, and the living room floor, was spattered with drying blood. It didn't take an expert to realize the man had been shot in the head. At first glance, Detective Shannon Lauren thought Patrick had lain down to rest on the couch when someone entered and shot him. Her partner, Sean McCarthy, leaned toward the idea of an accident. After 13 years of investigating crimes, he knew how to notice the smallest details, and here he saw nothing suspicious. The couple's two teenage sons, Sean and Thomas, were at school, leaving Linda as the sole witness to what had happened. She agreed to go to the station with the detectives and, without a lawyer, willingly answered their questions all night long. Linda Duffy was always unique. She had an unshakable, cheerful disposition, positive, lively, and full of humor. Wake her up in the middle of the night and she'd happily share a funny story. Some even called her a chameleon for her habit of mimicking different accents. Despite her quirks and eccentricities, those who knew Linda adored her. She was a wonderful person and a great friend. In the 1980s, she met her perfect match, Patrick Duffy. Patrick was an electronics engineer, a private pilot, and a firearms enthusiast. Linda often said her dreams had come true and that she couldn't have been happier. After dating for 4 years, they decided to get married. Friends and family alike believed the couple had truly found soulmates in one another, sharing a love for jokes, pranks, and playful antics. It was precisely this playful streak that became the cornerstone of Linda's account of what happened that day. She explained that she and Patrick had returned from the hospital where he had been treated for chronic circulation issues. Patrick was planning to visit the shooting range afterward. Normally, one of his 3 revolvers was kept in a small locked case, but that day, it was lying next to him. Linda usually didn't touch firearms, but that day she picked it up to have a closer look. And that's where her story began to take a bizarre turn. She said she asked Patrick where the bullets were, and he replied, "Over there." Then, mimicking the voice of the famous cartoon character Elmer Fudd, he added,
"No more bullets."
Laughing, Linda repeated,
"No more bullets?"
assuming the chamber was empty. She thought it would be safe to try a trick Patrick had once taught her. Through tears, she told detectives that she only wanted to impress her husband by showing off her cowboy-style shooting skills. Any fan of Westerns knows what that means. The hero fans the hammer of the revolver, quickly pulling the trigger repeatedly to take down a row of enemies. Linda Duffy claimed that once she started firing in this way, she couldn't stop and accidentally shot Patrick in the head. He had leaned forward at just the wrong moment, ending up directly in the line of fire. Her story was so incredible that it was hard to believe, yet at the same time, it seemed impossible to imagine her inventing it. The detectives listened to her account with a mixture of astonishment and skepticism. Detective Lauren didn't believe Linda, while his partner found the tale just crazy enough to be true. After the interview, they let Linda go home. There wasn't enough evidence to justify an arrest, but they wanted a clearer picture of how everything had unfolded. Their understanding deepened significantly once they received the medical examiner's report. The medical examiner found not 1 but 2 bullets in Patrick's head. The entry wounds were so close together that even seasoned officers hadn't noticed them initially. Linda claimed it was an accident, but she had shot her husband twice. This revelation planted doubts even in Detective McCarthy, who had initially believed her story. Still, he struggled to find a motive behind the crime. The Duffys seemed like a typical middle-class suburban family living near Los Angeles. Patrick had life insurance, but it had been taken out many years earlier. There was no evidence of infidelity either. Considering Linda's extreme eccentricity, McCarthy couldn't easily dismiss her version of events, yet it became increasingly hard for him to believe her after speaking with Tracy Pock, a firearms expert brought into the investigation. Linda claimed she fired like the heroes in Westerns. This is indeed possible and relatively easy with the right firearm. The revolvers commonly used in Westerns are single action, meaning the shooter can pull the trigger and rapidly fan the hammer to fire multiple rounds in quick succession. The cylinder rotates with each pull, allowing the shooter to continue firing without interruption. Patrick Duffy owned 2 such revolvers, but the one Linda used that day was not among them. It was a double-action revolver, which requires significantly more effort to perform such a trick. To fire in a cowboy-style rapid sequence with a double-action revolver, a shooter must execute several actions in the correct order. Pull the trigger, release the hammer, fan the hammer, pull the trigger again, release the hammer, and fan the hammer, all at high speed, with little to no time for aiming. This made Linda's claim of an accidental shooting increasingly implausible. However, there was another issue. The deafening noise of the first gunshot and the weapon's recoil would likely have startled Linda. For someone unfamiliar with handling firearms, it would be nearly impossible to fire 2 shots so close together that the bullet holes were almost indistinguishable, let alone have them both strike Patrick's head in nearly the same spot. 2 years later, Linda Duffy was called back to the station and shown a video of firearms expert Tracy Peck demonstrating rapid fire with a revolver. Unexpectedly, Linda admitted that she needed to make a small correction to her story. She confessed that she and Patrick had been practicing cowboy-style shooting with unloaded guns for years, at least 15-20 times, she calmly told the stunned detectives. The detectives grew increasingly convinced that Linda's story had little to do with the truth. However, 2 major hurdles remain. 1, they still lack conclusive evidence to definitively disprove her claims, and 2, they wanted to give her one last chance to demonstrate how the events of that day unfolded. They made her an unusual proposal: meet them at a shooting range where they would bring a replica of the revolver used in the incident and have her reenact her actions from that day. This plan was sound from every angle. Either Linda would prove her version of events, or the police would gain evidence that it was impossible for her to have shot Patrick accidentally. Confident she posed no further danger, the detectives let her go home to consider the offer. Days turned into weeks, then months, but Linda never responded to their proposal. In time, detectives Lauren and McCarthy were reassigned, and with new partners and fresh cases demanding their attention, old investigations began to fade into the background. Yet a few months later, the detectives found themselves back at the Duffy residence. They were puzzled by Linda's lack of response to their offer. Their surprise turned to outright astonishment when they arrived to find a for sale sign on the lawn. Linda's sons informed them that their mother had gone on a honeymoon to Italy. 1 year after Patrick's death, Linda Duffy became Linda Gwatz, having married Lorenz Gwatz, a world-class saxophonist who had performed at Carnegie Hall. She had met him online a year after Patrick's passing. Linda moved to Mississippi, where her new husband worked as a professor of music. She changed her appearance, dyed her hair, adopted a new style, and even took a job at the same university as Lawrence. The detectives could only shake their heads at the bizarre turn of events. Several years passed, and it seemed Linda must have thought everyone had forgotten about her. But Patrick's family could not let go of the lingering questions surrounding his death. While Linda had told police it was a tragic accident, she gave a very different story to Patrick's family later that same evening. According to them, Linda claimed that Patrick had accidentally shot himself. Patrick's sister and brother, Catherine Hunt, and her sibling, were skeptical from the start. They had grown up around firearms and adhered strictly to one cardinal rule: always unload your weapon before bringing it into the house. The next day at the funeral home, Linda confided in Catherine. Trembling and fearful of being hated, she spun another incredible version of the incident, describing it again as a freak accident. Despite her insistence, Patrick's family remained unconvinced, but they assumed the police had closed the case as an accident. It troubled them deeply that Linda had lied to them about the events of that day, but they had no means to challenge her story. Yet as time passed, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When they finally had the chance to revisit the case, Linda Duffy, or Linda Gwatz, was still on their minds. Detectives Lauren and McCarthy brought in a new expert, Paul Dolhauer, to examine the blood evidence from the crime scene. He reviewed the photos and police reports and concluded that Linda was lying. The woman claimed she had fired quickly and from the same spot. However, the blood spatter on her blouse in the wall told the expert a different story. According to her statements, the spatter appeared after the first shot, But for such patterns to form, the barrel would have had to be positioned 3 inches away from Patrick's head. The expert believed the second shot should have created a larger pool of blood on the floor, exactly where Linda claimed she had been standing. All that blood couldn't have avoided splashing onto her, yet she had only a few small drops on her. Police now believed that they had evidence proving Linda was lying. There was too little blood on her to support her story. The most likely scenario, according to investigators, was this. Patrick was asleep when his wife decided to commit the crime. She aimed and fired once, realized he was still alive, returned to the same position, aimed again, and fired a second time. This explained why the entry wounds were only 2 inches apart. The prosecutor decided to proceed with the case, and police spoke with Linda's colleagues. While they had always described her as charming, they now admitted they considered her a pathological liar. Even her close friend Julie said, "You either really liked Linda, or you realized you couldn't trust her. She always wanted to be the center of attention." This characterization was a revelation for the detectives and the district attorney, who concluded there was enough evidence to arrest Linda and charge her with the crime. 5 years after Patrick's death, Lieutenant McCarthy flew to Mississippi, where Linda was living with her new husband. For 2 weeks, members of the jury listened to incredible stories about Bugs Bunny, westerns, and testimony from experts on both sides who offered completely opposing interpretations of the events. It was too much for the jurors. They became deadlocked and could not reach a verdict, which meant a retrial would be necessary. The new trial began a year later, and Linda remained in jail during the interim. The battle between the prosecution and the defense was even fiercer this time. However, the prosecutor approached the case very differently. The main weakness of the prosecution's argument in the first trial was that, by all accounts, Linda and Patrick loved each other and were happy together. She had no obvious motive. This time, the prosecutor argued that Linda killed her husband because he was ill, and she feared having to care for him for the rest of his life. Additionally, the prosecutor decided not to show the jury interrogation videos in which Linda, sobbing uncontrollably, described her version of events to the police. By doing so, he effectively hamstrung the defense, which was barred from presenting those tapes themselves. As a result, the jury did not hear the story about Bugs Bunny, the couple's playful antics, or their cowboy-style shooting. Now, the only way for the jury to hear Linda's version of events was for her to testify and face cross-examination. This was exactly what the prosecutor was hoping for, but Linda was too afraid to take the stand. Her attorney found himself in a difficult position. He worried that without Linda's testimony, the jury would never hear about the fanfire shooting. However, he came up with a strategy. He discovered a reference to the shooting technique in Linda's 911 call, which had already been admitted as evidence by the prosecution. This allowed him to bring in a firearms expert who testified that firing a revolver like the one Linda used was not particularly difficult. Thus, the jury never heard about Linda and Patrick imitating cartoon characters. Instead, they were shown a compelling animation created by the prosecutor's office, vividly illustrating the prosecution's version of the events. In the animation, Linda calmly approached her sleeping husband and shot him. The jury deliberated for less than a day and found Linda guilty of second-degree murder. Linda's sons and her second husband pleaded with the judge for leniency, but his hands were tied. The verdict required him to sentence her to a term ranging from 40 years to life in prison. After the trial, journalists interviewed jurors from both the first and second trials to understand why the first jury had been unable to reach a verdict, while the second found her guilty within a day. Ironically, the old adage, "less is more," proved true in this case. In the first trial, the jury struggled to understand Linda's motive and could not convict her because everything might have happened as she explained. In the second trial, the jury heard only the bare facts, leaving no room for sentimentality.
In 2007, surveillance cameras captured a 24-year-old guy walking down College Street to a pizzeria. No one saw him leave the establishment, and he never appeared in the field of view of any cameras in the city again. 13 years later, we still don't know what happened to Kyle Fleischman that night. This story took place in Charlotte, North Carolina, a modern, beautiful, multicultural city that captivates with its southern charm. But just a few blocks away, on the other side of this bridge, lies a dangerous, grim park, where one might encounter members of the most violent and rapidly growing street gang in the world. Kyle was born on September 24, 1983, to Dick and Barbara Fleischman. Kyle was the couple's first child, and he has a younger brother and sister. The family moved to Charlotte in 2000 due to Dick's job at Fidelity Investments. Kyle attended the local Charlotte Catholic High School, and in 2006, he graduated from Elon College with a degree in business administration. When his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, he promised her they would fight the illness together. He loved his mom and supported her up until his disappearance. Therefore, everyone who knew him is convinced he couldn't have disappeared of his own free will. On November 8, 2007, Kyle, his mom Barbara, and his sister Noel gathered at the house of Kyle's best friend, Daniel Scagnelli. The four of them went to a stand-up comedy show by Dane Cook. They wanted to lift Barbara's spirits before she had to undergo some unpleasant procedures. They planned to have a few drinks and didn't want to drive home in that condition, so they took a taxi. After the show, Barbara and Noel went home, while Kyle and Daniel decided to continue the evening at a local bar. They headed to Buckhead Saloon in downtown Charlotte. According to Daniel, Kyle behaved as usual throughout the evening. The young men ordered strong drinks at the bar, but Daniel had to work the next day, so around 1 a.m. he was ready to go home. He saw Kyle talking to a girl, but still checked if he wanted to leave or stay. Kyle replied that he would stay at the bar for a little longer because he had met some nice people and wanted to chat with them. This wasn't unusual behavior. Kyle was very sociable and got along with everyone he met, his friend recalls. Daniel insists that when he left the bar, Kyle wasn't overly intoxicated and was having a great time. Daniel thought his friend would be fine and went home. However, that night, Kyle apparently had a disagreement with someone. Surveillance footage in the bar captured a verbal altercation between Kyle and 2 or 3 men. They were friends of the girl he had been talking to. The argument didn't escalate into anything serious, but the video shows the guys exchanging a few harsh words. Shortly after this, Kyle left the bar just before it closed, forgetting his jacket and bank card. He left around 2:20 a.m., and although it was -1 degree outside, he didn't return for them. He was seen talking to the same girl outside. As they talked, they crossed College Street, which is now called Fitzgerald Street. By this time, Kyle may have been tipsy because he had spent another hour and a half in the bar after Daniel left. After leaving the bar, street surveillance footage captured Kyle heading toward a nearby pizzeria, Fuel Pizza. He entered the place and ordered 2 slices of pizza with everything. As we know, he didn't have his bank card with him, but he found around $6 in cash in his pocket and paid for the food. The pizzeria cashier claims to have a photographic memory and remembers Kyle from that night. He stated that the customer seemed tipsy. However, the cashier didn't notice when the young man left the restaurant. This is where the story starts to get strange. After the young man left the pizzeria, none of the city's surveillance cameras managed to capture his actions. However, it is known that he began making strange phone calls. He made about 8 calls, the first at 2:42 a.m. and the last at 3:29 a.m. This means he was calling for about an hour. There would be nothing strange about Kyle trying to reach someone, but he was not calling just one person. He called several: his sister Daniel, his roommate, and even dialed his father's work phone, knowing full well that no one would be in the office at that hour. Interestingly, the calls were unusually short, lasting about 10 seconds each, meaning the phone could have only rung twice before no one had time to answer, especially at such a late hour. Obviously, Kyle didn't get through to anyone and didn't leave any voicemail messages. No one knows why he made these frantic calls for an hour. Maybe he knew his phone was dying and didn't wait too long for someone to pick up? Or was he scared of something and wanted someone to help him? The next morning, Kyle's sister, roommate, and father woke up to see the missed calls but weren't concerned, thinking the phone had accidentally dialed in Kyle's pocket. However, when Daniel saw not only the missed calls, but also Kyle's car still parked in his driveway, he realized something was wrong. Daniel tried calling Kyle back, but the call went straight to voicemail. He became worried and called Kyle's roommate to see if he had come home. Finding out he hadn't, Daniel called Kyle's mom and the police to report his friend missing. That same morning, he created the first-ever Facebook page informing people about a missing person. By noon, nearly 50,000 people had joined the group and started sharing photos and information about Kyle Fleischman's disappearance. Thanks to the Facebook page, hundreds of people gathered to start searching for the missing young man. Meanwhile, the police spoke with the pizzeria cashier. When Kyle's father heard that his son had ordered a pizza with all the toppings, he was convinced it was his son. The father explained that Kyle always orders his pizza this way because he loves a variety of toppings. The cashier noted that the young man had come in alone, but he didn't see him leave. The police also talked to bar patrons and taxi drivers in the area. They logically concluded that Kyle was calling everyone because he was looking for someone to give him a ride home, and it's quite possible he encountered a taxi driver. One taxi driver told a private detective, hired by Kyle's parents, that he had seen a young man matching Kyle's description walking along North Davidson Street near the 1100 block early that morning. The driver found it strange because it was cold outside, and the young man was lightly dressed. Moreover, a respectable-looking young man had no reason to be in such a place. The driver added that the young man seemed disoriented, but he still didn't stop to help him and let him walk on. But walk where? Kyle leaves the bar, buys pizza. All of this seems logical, but why then did he head to North Davidson Street? The fact is, this part of the city, and especially this street, is considered an incredibly dangerous area. Kyle, being a local resident, certainly knew it was a scary place and would never have voluntarily gone there alone at night. Perhaps the taxi driver was mistaken. Law enforcement tracked the phone's ping and made a startling discovery. The phone remained active until 4 a.m. when it was presumably turned off or its battery died. During this time, it left a digital trail from Fuel Pizza to the previously mentioned North Davidson Street. The last phone ping was recorded just 30 centimeters from the bridge leading into Cordelia Park, known for its very bad guys, including members of the violent street gang MS-13. The park is about 3 kilometers from Buckhead's saloon, meaning Kyle had to walk 40 minutes without a jacket in freezing temperatures. After this, Kyle was never seen again. There was no activity on his bank accounts or cards, and his phone was never turned on again. The police brought in 2 tracking dogs. They were given Kyle's jacket, which he had worn that day and left in the bar, to catch his scent. To ensure accuracy, the dogs were sent out separately. Both dogs led their handlers to Fuel Pizza, after which, for some inexplicable reason, both made a large circle around it. Judging by Kyle's behavior, it seems he thought someone was following him and tried to throw them off his trail. After this strange loop, the dogs led the handler down North Davidson Street to Cordelia Park, but their work had to be stopped. The handlers and dogs were called off because it was too dangerous to be in the park at night, both for the animals and the people. The next day, handler Linda Dunn took the dogs back and resumed from where they had left off. The dogs crossed the park and tracked Kyle's scent to a construction site about 200 meters away. Linda reported that as they approached the site, they noticed the smell of decomposition. She said the odor was very strong and she was unsure if it was from an animal or a person. They tried to locate the source of the smell but were unsuccessful. Local residents later also complained about the foul odor, but nothing was done about it. Both of Linda's dogs followed the same path independently, and more dogs were brought in to help search the large area of the construction site, but nothing was found. At that time, there was a lot of freshly dug soil because workers were digging trenches for pipes. Construction of new houses was ongoing back then, and now it's a whole neighborhood. When the neighborhood construction was completed, it likely buried any evidence that could have helped solve the mystery of Kyle's disappearance. But the discoveries by the handlers didn't end there. Linda's partner mentioned encountering a homeless man on North Davidson Street who was willing to talk. People living on the street don't usually like talking to the police, but handlers are a different story. The man said he saw gang members in the park attack Kyle that night. However, he didn't know what happened to Kyle's body afterward. In 2009, a federal judge issued a search warrant for the construction site at 16th and North Davidson Street. The area was searched, but what was found remains unknown. This is because the judge sealed the documents, restricting public access. Documents cannot be sealed based on mere assumptions and theories. It is evident that law enforcement discovered something extremely significant. Additionally, agents from the ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, were involved in the investigation. Their involvement typically indicates cases involving contraband, gangs, or violent crimes involving firearms. FBI agents also worked on the case and similarly sealed the investigation's findings. This decision suggests that they uncovered new evidence critical to the case or identified a key witness. Kyle's family and friends feel that he found his final resting place at that construction site. All they want is to know exactly what happened to him and to say goodbye in the way he deserves. Kyle's father believes his son fell victim to a random robbery. He is still actively searching and assisting the police and private detectives. The Facebook page created by Daniel remains active, where people can express their support for everyone who knew Kyle. The case is considered open, and it has been announced that anyone who provides information leading to Kyle's whereabouts or helps solve the case will receive a $50,000 reward. There are several theories that have emerged around this case. The most popular theory is that Kyle, without realizing it, entered the park and was intercepted by gang members. This is not such an incredible version. However, it raises doubts about the actions of the gang members, who would unlikely have been concerned with thoroughly hiding the young man's body. They had no reason to do so. The second popular theory is similar to the first, suggesting a random robbery that ended extremely badly. Perhaps someone saw Kyle leaving the bar and decided it was an opportunity to get some money. When they found out he had no money, they either got angry or Kyle might have started to fight back. However, many do not believe a gang was involved and suggest he might have fallen into the water, which is very dangerous in his condition. But this is also debatable because nothing was found in the water near where he disappeared. Of course, there is also the theory of voluntary disappearance, but it is hard for people who knew Kyle to believe this because it was completely out of his character. He had no financial difficulties or complicated personal relationships, and he was determined to support his mother through her treatment. The question arose as to whether Kyle's argument with the men in the bar had resolved. Others wondered why Kyle went down North Davidson Street on a cold November night without a jacket. The detective hired by Kyle's parents believes the young man left his belongings in the bar in a hurry. He claims that the surveillance camera captured the girl Kyle was talking to leaving the bar first, followed by Kyle himself. They were then seen talking on the street again. As for Kyle's parents and friends, they are convinced the construction site became Kyle's final resting place. But they are frustrated that nothing can be proven. After all these years, there is no evidence, no witnesses, and no Kyle. Only many questions and an unending heartache. Barbara admits that time has helped dull the pain. It's true what they say about time, she says. I prefer to think about the happy moments. Her husband, Dick, found it harder. He says it's difficult for him to focus on anything positive because he was so involved in the search, always thinking about what they might have missed. Despite the time that has passed, the case still resonates with many people. A young, handsome guy from a decent family, a university graduate, hardworking, and a loving son. It could have been anyone. He's the boy next door, says Detective John Tuttle. Today, Kyle Fleischman would be 37 years old. Not a day goes by that I don't think of him, says his father, Dick. And Barbara admits she fantasizes about what her eldest son's life would be like now. I think about what he would be doing. I see his friends getting married and having children, and I imagine he would have a family too, and it would be wonderful.